in most cases, but for apps, it's the opposite. It feels like apps are maybe 10 years behind websites because they don't scale to larger sizes. A lot of apps don't support landscape mode, for example. And in this presentation or webinar, I will tell you a little bit about the background and what people with disabilities would like or how they use apps, what kind of tools they use, and also about legal, like is there any legal requirement for my app to be accessible, and also something about guidelines that have been made for apps, and also common mistakes which I have found during my own apps, but also found for other apps I've been working on. But first, I would like to start with the content. So the first part is about accessibility. What is accessibility? And then we will have a total of 7 chapters, which are already introduced. So let's start with accessibility. What is the goal? Well, accessibility, especially in the English world, or the English word, basically, it's basically about being able to use something and also making sure that everyone can participate. So it means that if you develop an app, make sure that people that are blind or maybe using a different kind of input than touch, that they can also use your app. So I would like to ask you to write maybe in the chat, and maybe also allow some people to speak, like what apps are you working on? Just to give a kind of indication, what kind of apps are you working on? And which programming languages do you use? Do you use Kotlin on Android, or maybe Objective-C or Swift on iOS, or do you use maybe Xamarin, React Native, or some other kind of framework? Would be interesting to know. And also a general question like, what do you already know about accessibility? Do you have some knowledge already about this topic? Is it completely new? And basically, maybe also write down the reason why you are here today and what you would like to learn. I think if I switch to the other chat, I'm not sure if I can still see the chat. So let's see. Yeah, it pauses my sharing. I can see the chat. Oh, someone said there's several gray rectangles covering the presentation. I believe. Oh, I think might be this one. So I see a first response now in the chat. Alberto saying, I want to learn how to make Android apps more accessible, what to keep in mind. Yeah, this is something we will cover today. So I think maybe a big difference between Android and iOS is, or maybe mobile apps and websites, is that on websites you have the same website that works on multiple browsers by default, like Firefox, Chrome, Internet Explorer, maybe even if you still support something a little bit older. But the difference with mobile apps is that a lot of times Android and iOS, they can be two separate or two completely different apps. So that can be a different strategy how to make them accessible. Then I see a new response from Frank, only website. So I guess experience with accessibility on websites and no experience with mobile apps. Mallory, I noticed that my work uses things like red/green colors to portray service health in dashboards. This is very unfriendly to colorblind people. We don't make apps, but it still seems important. Yeah, it's important to mention. I will also talk about this later in the second chapter about disabilities, because there are quite a lot of people actually that have color blindness, and for them it can really be hard to distinguish some charts, for example, or colors. So maybe if you say something like, hey, press the green button, maybe they don't see it as green, maybe they see a different color. So that's why you should always say maybe, hey, press the green button on the right, so then they know, oh, it's the button on the right and not the button on the left. Wouter saying, I'm working on a time and attendance web app. So this is a web application, C# and React. Barely know anything about accessibility. Watched an overview recently, but haven't practiced anything. So it seems like there's also some people here that maybe work on web apps or websites. not maybe on native mobile apps. Will mostly native mobile apps, but the differences can apply to websites. So let's continue with the presentation. So the disabilities. It's quite a lot of people. So these are recent numbers from the Netherlands. And you can see that I also put elderly in there, because a lot of times when you get older, you get disability. So maybe your vision gets worse, or maybe your motoric skills get a little bit worse, or maybe your cognitive abilities might be less than other people. So I think it's quite important, if you look at accessibility, it also means that elderly should also be able to use your app. So the app needs to be clear for them as well. And the second largest group, which to me was quite shocking, it's low literate. So people that have difficulty with harder or more higher level language. It's 2.5 million people in the Netherlands. So it's almost 1 in 5 people in the Netherlands that are low literate. So that's a really large group. And then we get to a little bit more specific disabilities. So like a hearing impairment. So you can be, maybe if you're watching a video and if it doesn't have subtitles, then you maybe not able to understand what someone is saying in a video. And then, as mentioned before, we have also color blindness. It's also 742,000. So it's also a really large group. It's almost 1 million people in the Netherlands alone that are colorblind. So make sure to pick your colors wisely, so that colorblind people can also understand the difference between them. But then you have some other disabilities like ADHD. So maybe not, I think that's what a lot of websites do. They do a lot of pop-ups and other distractions on the screen that really can be difficult for some people to concentrate on their task. If they scroll down and suddenly the screen jumps around, or you get a pop-up, it can really be hard for someone to remain focused on their task that they're trying to accomplish. And then we have like visual impairments. And it's also very important, for example, for websites and also for apps, that you can increase the font size. There's a lot of people that are visually impaired, and they really need a larger font size to be able to read the text in an app. So if your app has a font size of 12 pixels, but maybe they prefer a font size of maybe 20 pixels, or some people even prefer like 30 or 40 pixels font size. So you need to make sure that your app is capable of supporting a larger font size, and make sure that no errors occur. So maybe buttons, for example, a lot of times buttons, they only fit one line of text. If someone has a really large font size, then it becomes 2 lines of text. So if your button has a fixed height and doesn't support multiple lines, then people that have a really large font size enabled, they can't see what this button is saying. And then another really important group is blind people, because maybe you don't expect people that are blind to use mobile applications, because a mobile phone is really about seeing what's on the screen and touch input and touching the right coordinates on the screen. So that's why they use a tool. It's called a screen reader. So basically it reads what you can see on the screen. So for example, if there's a button on the screen and it says something like save, then people that use a screen reader, they will hear save button. And then because they know that it's a button and it has the title of save, they know, okay, this button is going to save something. It's the same for all elements in your app interface. They need to be described or have a label and also have a role to them, like a button, or is it a list, or is it a heading? Because otherwise people that are blind, they can't see what's on the screen. So this really needs to be conveyed through the programmatic markup of your app, so that screen readers can tell people what's on the screen and what kind of their purpose is on the screen. So let's continue with assistive technology. So what do people that have disabilities, what do they use to still be able to use their mobile phones? So I think most important to know is that some people interact with their phones in like a completely different way than we do. So for interaction, on the left side, you have screen reader, which I already mentioned. So it reads everything that's on the screen. So it's mostly used by people that are visually impaired or blind. And then you have switch control. This is a button which you connect to your phone, and you can just press on the button to navigate through the interface. So it's similar to a screen reader. Basically, you get a focus on the screen, and then when you press the button, it moves the focus to the next element. And then if you tap again, maybe you can perform clicks. I've also shown a video, so it will become more clear. Then you have voice control. I think maybe some developers have already used this before. You can control your smartphone by voice. And by this, I don't mean dictation like Siri or Google Assistant, but I really mean voice control is really different. It can, for example, say, hey, press the close button or tap on the second item. You can really give some commands to interact with apps. I'll also show a video of this later. And then something that's important also to consider, that some people, they connect a keyboard to their smartphone. And it's possible to control your smartphone with a keyboard. So you can use the arrow keys, also the tab button and the enter button to interact with an app. So some people, for example, that have maybe motoric disabilities, maybe they're not able to move their fingers and touch something on the screen, but maybe they are able to press an arrow key on the keyboard. So for them, it's important to realize that some people, they don't use touch to interact with an app, but they use a different way to interact. And then we have some other assistive technologies like vision, mobility, hearing, and learning. So I already mentioned vision. Some people, they want to adjust their text size. Some people want to have a bold text. Some people would like to have a higher contrast. And then for hearing, maybe you can implement automatic subtitles, or you can amplify the sound of certain videos. You can pair maybe a hearing aid to your smartphone, and then you can play, for example, Spotify. It's able to play music through the connected hearing aid with Bluetooth. There's also new innovation on this part. And then for mobility, so people that are maybe in a wheelchair, or maybe they have lost a limb, or maybe they have less fingers, they can maybe use a custom touch to still perform certain gestures, or they can dictate certain tasks like Siri or Google Assistant to perform certain tasks, or maybe they can make shortcuts for certain apps to get stuff done a little bit quicker, because of disability, they might be slower than other people to complete certain tasks. And then we have learning. So for learning, so like it's the cognitive disability, maybe you can have text prediction. You can also have read selection. So when someone doesn't understand the word, or they can't read it, maybe they can select the word, and then they can press on like a play button, and maybe they can hear the word, and maybe then they maybe understand it. And also you can maybe have a dictionary implement in the app for difficult words, so users can look it up in a dictionary and get the definition. So all these technologies which I mentioned are already built into your phone. So on all Android phones and all Apple devices, so iPhone, iPad, whatever, everything is already built in. There's a big difference with, for example, websites where you have to install assistive technology on your laptop or computer. But on mobile phones, everything is already built in. So that's why we as developers, we can take advantage of all these technologies that are built in. But not only that, it also means that because it is built into the mobile phones, it means that people are using them because it's really easy for them to just go to settings, accessibility, and just turn on some of these features. And if your app doesn't support this feature, then it means that users will not get the experience they expect. I think I saw a message. So let's answer some questions. So Sophie, where did you get these numbers from? On our website, apt.nl, you can find all the sources. So it's all from government agencies that have reported these numbers. So if you go to our website and then to knowledge base and then to disabilities, or in Dutch beperkingen, there you can find the source for the numbers. How do you define low literate? But we use also the same definition that the government uses. So it means that basically it means that B1 level. is the most they understand. So if it's B2 language, C1 or C2, then it becomes difficult for people to understand. So if they get it's difficult for them to understand what the letter is saying. Nikita is asking, curious to know how you feel about UX design versus, for example, color blindness. There's also a lot of testing according to color, which button converts better, green or red. Wondering how you can do proper UX with taking all the disabilities into account. Yeah, that's definitely difficult, because a lot of times especially with marketing and sales, they want to have a button with a really contrasting color, maybe a color that really sticks out, like a green or red button, if the rest of the website is a different color. So yeah, that's difficult. But as Sophie also mentioned, there are tools available for example, Figma and Sketch, and also other tooling where you can simulate disabilities like color blindness, and then you can still understand a little bit which kind of buttons or which kind of colors might work well for everyone. But it's definitely difficult that if you make certain choices with accessibility, it can also mean that the average user, which doesn't need some kind of high contrast features or other kind of features, maybe they can get a little bit worse experience. So it's really important with accessibility that you make the right choices and make the experience better for everyone. So that's really difficult. There's no really clear answer to how to achieve this. Then maybe some of you are wondering, well, we're just seeing all these technologies. So what do people actually use? So a company in the Netherlands, Q42, they put analytics in some of their apps, and they collected data from 1 million Dutch app users. And that showed that almost 33%, so 1 in 3 people out of 1 million, they have changed the text size. So they have either a smaller font size or a larger font size. So most people have a larger font size. And also shows that 1 in 4 people, they have dark mode turned on. So a lot of apps, they don't support dark mode, but dark mode is a lot of developers, they like using dark mode, but it's also important for people with certain disabilities, like low vision or other kind of, some people have difficulties with light perception. Then dark mode can really help them to reduce strain on their eyes. Then we have some less used accessibility settings like screen zoom in, bold text, restoring by shaking, read selection, and reduce transparency. But for example, I was surprised with bold text that 7% of the people out of 1 million, so that's a really large sample, they have turned on bold text. So basically that means that they want to have all text on the screen should be bold. So no text should be regular, light, or semi-bold, everything should be bold. So that's quite a large amount that has the setting enabled. And if you combine all these settings, it means that almost half of people, so 43%, they use 1 or more of the accessibility settings. And 14% of users, they use 2 or more of these settings. So there's a lot more settings with lower percentage. But yeah, it turns out that maybe 4 out of 10 people, they really do use these accessibility features. So a lot more people than you might expect. So it's really important to use those accessibility settings in your app to take them into account. I would like to show some videos now. Let's check if there are more questions. Nope. So I'd like to show some videos about these assistive technologies so you can get an idea of how these tools that some people use actually work. So the first is the screen reader, which will read out everything that's on the screen, which is mostly used by people that are blind or have visual impairment.
Screen anywhere to hear the item under your finger.
FaceTime. Double tap to open.
This works with almost any word, feature, or app name. You don't have to tap directly on something to locate it. Instead, quickly swipe right or left with one finger anywhere on the screen to find the item you want, and VoiceOver will read out each item as you swipe.
Calendar. Wednesday, March 24th. Photos. Camera.
You can also drag your finger over the screen.
Doc. Messages.
Double tap anywhere on the screen to open or activate an app, link, or button.
Messages. Edit. Button. Compose. Button. Messages. Heading. Search. Search field. Dictate. Button. Conversations. Eliza Blog.
That was a quick demonstration of the screen reader. So for example, if there are certain buttons or images in your app, for example, you have like a share button or you have some kind of favorite button, which uses an image, you need to make sure that the image is labeled. So otherwise someone, or the voiceover, it will just read out image. You don't know if it's a favorite image or if it's favorited, yes or no, because the screen reader doesn't know if it's a yellow favorite icon or a gray favorite icon. So you need to make sure that you actually set a label to images, for example. So on our knowledge page, you can find more information about TalkBack, which is the screen reader on Android, and also on VoiceOver, which is a screen reader on iOS. And also in our own app, which is also free to download. You can also learn some of these gestures, because I really suggest everyone to try out the screen reader on the apps you're developing yourself, or maybe on apps of maybe companies you work with, and then see if it's possible for you to use this app. Basically, what you can also do is blindfold yourself and then, open the app with a screen reader and see if it's possible for you to use it without using your eyes. Okay, so the next one is switch control. So this one is more, you have like some kind of switch, and you can press it, and then you can navigate through the app. So as the video will show, it's quite slow to use.
Linear scanning and allow the use of a switch or keyboard to interact with your Android device. Start scanning by pressing the switch, and once the item you want is highlighted, select it by pressing the switch again. There are many hardware options available. Choose what works best for you. To change options or access the setup guide, select Settings within the Switch Access menu. This menu offers customized options to meet your individual needs. From messages to maps, access your world with a switch. Linear scanning and allow the use of.
As the video shows, it's can be really slow to, for example, send an emoji, because you have to wait until the focus moves across the screen and then press the button. It's really slow. So that's why, for example, your app should never have any time limits, because, for example, maybe you expect people to fill in a form in 1 minute, but maybe if they use a switch control, maybe it takes them 5 minutes because they have difficulty entering their details. So that's why apps and also websites try to avoid time limits for certain tasks. The same case here, we have knowledge base with information about switch access on Android and iOS. And for developers, you don't need to buy this switch control. You can use, for example, the volume keys up and down to simulate switch control. So I also suggest you, if you ever want to try out if your app supports this, you can just simulate it by using the volume buttons. So the next one is voice control. It's basically voice control has the same target group as people with use switch control. But voice control uses voice, so it's a lot quicker, as you can see in this video.
Wake up. Voice control is a breakthrough feature that gives you full control of your devices, with just your voice, period. It's a whole new way to do everything you love, period. Like this. Correct love. 16. Open photos. Scroll up. Show numbers. 13. Click share. 3. Next one today. Thumbs up emoji. Click send. Open maps. Show grid. Long press at 20. Open app switcher. 4. Tap share. Tap Tim. Tap send. Hey, good to see you. Open music. Turn up the volume. All right.
Yeah, so voice control is also available on all the Android devices and all iOS devices. So yeah, you can try it out yourself and try it out with some apps and see if they are able to use them completely with voice. A lot of apps are not accessible with voice access, but yeah, there's one way to find out. You can go to our knowledge base, read how to use it, and then try it out with one of the apps on your device, and maybe even on the apps you develop yourself to see if they can be used with voice control. Maybe also important to mention that, for example, the screen reader, switch access, and voice control, they use the same API, the same accessibility API. So if your app works with voice control, it usually means that you can also use it with switch control and also with the screen reader. So that's why if you take some time for accessibility and make it work correctly for example, voice control, a lot of other users that use other assistive technologies, they also benefit. So really suggest you to try out voice control sometime. And the last one, which is maybe not so obvious for mobile phones, it's the keyboard. Why I show this is because there are guidelines now for apps, and I will tell more about legal afterwards. But one of the requirements is that an app, it should be accessible by using a keyboard. So I personally don't really know a lot of people that use a keyboard to control their mobile phones, but some people do. So that's why it's important to also support keyboard navigation. So this video will give a short demonstration of how to navigate using just an external keyboard. That one goes on for a little bit longer. There's a lot of shortcuts available to use your device with, for example, to go back and to go to the next app and to search and those kind of shortcuts. So if you want to comply to the new requirements for apps, you need to make sure that you can completely use all functionality of the app. So everything should be able to be controlled by using an external keyboard. So on Android, you can connect using Bluetooth or maybe also micro USB or USB-C. On iOS, easiest way is also to use Bluetooth. But before you can use a keyboard to control your device, you need to make sure that you turn on the extensive keyboard functions. So if you go to Settings, Accessibility Keyboards, you can turn on this feature. Otherwise, you're only able to type in input fields. If you turn on the extensive keyboard functions, you can also use the keyboard to navigate by using the arrow keys and the tab and the shift and delete key, for example. So yeah, if you have a Bluetooth keyboard laying around, make sure to connect it to your mobile phone and yeah, try it out and see if you can use apps using just the keyboard. I see there are no questions to this. Largest. This is maybe the one that maybe has the highest impact on users, because a lot of people, they would like to use large text in an app, and you don't need to build this into your app like a different settings menu. There is already a settings menu in Android and on iOS where people can set their preferred font size for all the apps they use. So on Android, if you use like SP, like the scaled pixels, it already uses the font size that the users entered in the settings app. And on iOS, it's called dynamic font size. And you can use like a scale factor to increase the font size in your app. So I really suggest you to turn on a really large font size in the settings, and then open some apps and maybe the apps you're working on, and then see if they adapt. So do the font size, the fonts in the app, does it get bigger or does it just stay the same? It should increase if users have a preference for using a larger font size. This one is really, 1 in 3 people have a different font size enabled. So it's really a high impact one to consider for your app. Then I'm going to be a little bit short on this because we are developers and there's a lot of people to work on the legal stuff, I guess. But I think it's good to know there are basically 4 ones to take into account. The most impactful right now is the temporary decision on digital accessibility. So this one is for the whole of Europe, but each country has like a different interpretation of it. So in Netherlands, it means that from 23 September 2020, so last year, all websites have to be accessible from government agencies. So not all apps, but just apps from governments. And this year, on 23rd of June, apps also need to be accessible. So for example, the Corona Check app or DigiD app or any app from governments, they need to be accessible. So what does accessible mean? It means it needs to comply to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, which are written for websites, but the same guidelines apply to apps. But I will tell you a little bit more about these guidelines later. Then we have the European Accessibility Act, which is maybe more important for most app developers because it will also affect commercial apps. So maybe if you're a commercial party and you have some kind of commercial app or whatever, they also need to become accessible. So not just governments, every app needs to become accessible. So this will go in force in 2025. So there's still a couple of years to go. Also not sure yet, when is an app accessible? Is it going to use the same guidelines or maybe different guidelines? Not sure, but 2025, it's coming. So if you're developing a new app or you are building like a new version of your app, make sure to make it accessible because 2025, it needs to be accessible. So the earlier you start, the easier it is and also the cheaper it is in development hours. Then we have already in force for a lot of years is the UN Disability Convention and also the Equal Treatment of Disability or Chronic Illness Act. So these basically mean that people that have disabilities or chronic illnesses or any kind of disability, regardless of the disability, they should be able to participate in the apps also, and also, for example, stores or websites, whatever, everything, they need to be able to use it as well. So, for example, one example is Rabobank. They got sued one time by someone that was blind because he was no longer able to use the Rabobank app when they updated it to a new version. So they went from version 1 to version 2, like a really big update. and suddenly he was not able to do his own banking business anymore. So he actually won this lawsuit. It was in the Netherlands, and then Rabobank had to keep the version 1 of the app also available in the App Store and Play Store. So this is really, it's a risk for companies. If your app is not accessible, even in the Netherlands, you can still get sued. So it's not just the United States. Even in the Netherlands, there's also legislation which, you can get sued if your app is not accessible. See, no questions so far. So if you have any questions, you can just type them in the chat. Now, I would like to be a little bit short on this one, because if you're developers, you can just look at the guidelines yourself and figure them out a little bit. Because soon I will just show some examples of the guidelines which go wrong a lot of times, because the guidelines are or to explain in a short time. But to summarize, there's 4 principles. So the first one is perceivable, second is operable, third is understandable, and fourth is robust. And each of these principles, they have guidelines, and each guideline has success criteria. So those are the blocks you see on the screen. So the success criteria, basically what it means, it's true or false. So either your app has it or it does not. So maybe you can check, does your app support landscape mode? So can you rotate your app? Does it work? Yes or no? No, it does not. Okay, then it means you fail the success criteria, and that means your app is not accessible. So how many criteria do apps need to comply to? Right now, with the temporary decision, it means that apps need to comply to level A and the level AA guidelines and principles and criteria. So that means there's 50 criteria that your app needs to comply to. So that means that every screen in your app needs to check off 50 criteria. So if your app is really big, like lots of screens, then there's a big chance that there's an issue on one of the screens. So I think that's one of the issues right now with the guidelines, that it means it's either your app is accessible, which means it's 100% passes all the criteria, or if you make like one mistake in 1,000 screens, your app is not accessible according to the guidelines, even though maybe people with disabilities are still able to use it. So I'm not really happy, of course, with the guidelines. I would like to see maybe you can say your app is 90% accessible or 99%. This is also something that might happen in the future with the 3rd version of the guidelines. But for now, this is what we have to deal with. There's 50 criteria, and I will show you which ones are most common mistakes. But first, before we go to the common mistakes, so one of the biggest mistakes is that a lot of people, they don't test their own app on accessibility. So there's videos from Apple and also from Google on testing your own app on accessibility. So on Xcode, for example, there's Accessibility Inspector. Also on Android, they even have a separate app that you can download on the Play Store to inspect your own app. I think that's the biggest mistake, that a lot of people, they never test their app. So I would really suggest you to watch maybe one of those videos, or maybe go on YouTube, and then you can find out how to test your own app. And then what are the most common mistakes that I have found when I do like accessibility audits of apps? Most common, I think it's, they're not really in order, but I think most common is no landscape mode, because a lot of apps, they only support portrait mode. So they only support, upright, and then when you rotate it, nothing happens. It's one of the guidelines that your app needs to support multiple orientations, so also landscape mode. And a lot of apps, they do not support this. Then second one is no support for large font size. So apps, they need to, if users have a preference for larger font size, they need to be able to increase it. Then we have also no labels, for example, with images, headings which are not marked, lists which are not marked, buttons which are not marked, links which are not marked, or with links which you cannot activate using accessive technology. And then we have elements which are not grouped together, and also sometimes there are issues with incorrect focus order. So I will tell more about these topics after we take a short 5-minute break. So I really would like to ask everyone if you have any questions about these most common mistakes, because it's quite likely that your app also has one of these mistakes. Make sure to ask them in the chat so I can maybe help out. To see if your app supports these features. So let's see you in 5:50 p.m. All right, so welcome back everyone, as far as I can see. So now some examples, which are examples I have found during my own work as a developer and during some of accessibility audits I've done. So in the examples I will show is from the COVID app, so the Corona Check app, and also some other government apps. All these apps are also open source. So maybe if you're also wondering how to make an accessible app, I can really recommend you to check out the source code of the Corona Check app, for example, but also Corona Melder app. It's also accessible. And also GGD Contact is also a new app. It's also accessible. Doesn't yet comply to all of the guidelines, but it's really close. So it's really one of the best apps for accessibility. So what are some of the mistakes I have found? Well, one this is success criterion 1.3.4. So what does this mean? The number, the 1, it stands for principle 1. The second number 3 stands for the third guideline, and then 4 stands that is the fourth success criteria. So if you Google this, like WCAG and then 1.3.4, you can find the full explanation of how to comply to this success criterion. But basically it means that apps, they should be able to rotate in all orientations. So how can you make sure that your app works? Well, first of all, make sure that you enable auto rotate on your device. Sometimes people have their own device locked to auto rotate, so then it's not the problem of the app, it's a problem of the device. And then if you go to your code, you can go to the screen orientation attribute. Because basically it should never be set. So if you do like a Control F and you search for screen orientation, yeah, it should never be set anywhere in the app, because the app should be able to rotate in all orientations. And if you use the screen orientation attribute, you lock it to, for example, portrait mode or landscape mode. There are some exceptions. For example, maybe if you scan a QR code, maybe it makes sense to lock screen orientation to portrait mode, and your app can still be accessible because it's part of the it's easier for people. But most of the times, yeah, your app needs to support landscape mode. For example, if you have a banking app, or one example is also a DigiD app, it doesn't support the landscape mode. But soon, 23rd of June, it needs to support landscape mode because it's a government app and it needs to be accessible according to these guidelines. But I'm pretty sure that when the deadline is there, it will not support landscape mode, because landscape mode is quite difficult to implement, because it means that you have a really wide screen and maybe some elements need to change order, or maybe some buttons are too tall, or maybe some content doesn't fit on the screen anymore. It can be quite difficult to support landscape mode in your app. And because it's difficult and because it costs time and money, a lot of apps don't support it, because then the product owner or the customer, they say, yeah, well, I don't need landscape mode, just use portrait mode, that's enough. But if you want to have an accessible app, it needs to have landscape mode as well. So on iOS, it's the opposite. Instead of enabling auto rotate, they have something called lock. So you can lock the rotation. So make sure to not lock it. On iOS, you can search for UI interface orientation mask. This flag should never be set, because if it's set, same as on Android, it means it's locked to, for example, upside down or portrait or landscape. So if you search for this flag in your project, you can find out if there's any screens that are locked to portrait mode. Then you can maybe try out what happens if you remove this flag. Does your app work in landscape mode, or does it need some work maybe to fix the layout? It can be a lot of work. So yeah, if you build a new app, make sure to never disable landscape mode, because if you support landscape mode from the start, it's quite easy. But if you have to change 100 screens, then it's a lot of work. Any questions about this? I don't see anything yet in the chat. So if you have any questions, for example, maybe about the exceptions, or maybe about your own app, does it need to support landscape mode, for example? feel free to ask them. The second one, large font size. So it's part of two success criteria. One is 1.4.4, which describes that font size needs to be able to made larger, so have a large font size. And then 1.4.10, that one means that text can never be cut off anywhere on the screen. So on the middle, on the right, you can see an example that on large font size, the text becomes multi-line, and then some of the text is cut off at the bottom, so that you can't see the text anymore. And it's the same with the example on the bottom right. You probably don't know what this says. I know it says kopieer leefregels, so it says like copy living rules. You don't know that, you don't know what it's going to do. So that's why it's important to support multi-line text for all components in your app. So buttons need to have multiple lines, checkboxes, text, everything needs to have support for multiple lines. And also you have to make sure that elements can scale to a larger height, for example. So if you limit, for example, this checkbox, it has support for multiple lines of text, but it doesn't have support for larger height because it's fixed height. So make sure to check this in your app. The success criteria defines that you need to be able to scale content up to 200%. So for example, on websites, this makes sense, right? Because on websites, you maybe have a font size of 14 pixels. So if you use zoom to 28 pixels, then it's quite easy to check. But on apps, you don't have this luxury. For example, on iOS, you have this scale, like a slider. So the default scale is 4. But if you put it on the maximum font size, it's 7, but it's only 122%. So it's only 22% larger. So you have to enable a button, which is called accessibility font size. Then you get even more scales, and then you can put it on scale 12, which is like 270%. If you put it on scale 10, it's approximately 200% font size. So if you want to support, conform to this criteria, go to your iOS settings and put it on scale 10 out of 12. And your app still needs to work with this kind of font size. On Android, it's a little bit different, but it also has some kind of scaling mechanism. So you can just try it out yourself. So how do you fix this in an app? Well, on Android, you can use scale independent pixels. I guess most developers already use this. It's called SP. It's the default font size, basically. Because if you use, for example, 18 SP, for some people it might look like 18 pixels height. But some people, it might be 36 pixels height. So the SP, it uses like a scaling factor to increase the font size automatically for you. But because Android does this automatically, it can also turn into some issues. Because, for example, if you don't know that your app supports this, maybe you get one of the issues I'm showing here in the bottom right. Maybe some of those issues are present in your app because you didn't know that your app supported this. On iOS, it's a little bit different. If you use a custom font size, it doesn't support scaling out of the box. You need to implement something called dynamic font size, and you need to apply a scaling factor to your custom font to make it the correct size. But if you use the default Apple fonts, they already implement the dynamic font size. So if your app is using the default font size on iOS, make sure to turn on the large font size and see for yourself if people that have this setting enabled have any issues in your app. Because the same case here as Android, maybe you didn't know that your app supported large font size. So make sure to check it out and then try to fix all the issues, which can be quite difficult and frustrating sometimes. But it's important to support the largest font size possible. So also people who have really bad eyesight are still able to use your app with their preferred font size. So one question, Alan, how to avoid having the text cut? Is it a property that we have to activate? It's a good question. It's a little bit different on Android and iOS. For example, on Android, for height, you can have wrap content or match parent, for example. So if you use one of those properties, it already automatically scales for you. But a lot of times on iOS, it happens because a lot of interfaces are built with UI table view cells, so like a list item. And a lot of times the table view cells have a fixed height, for example, 100 pixels or 200 pixels. That doesn't work. But now on iOS, there's a property, it's called automatic height of rows. So if you make your app using constraints, you can constrain, for example, the text 16 pixels to the left, 16 to the top, 16 to the right, and 16 to the bottom. And then it calculates the height of the text with the font. You know how big this cell is becoming. So basically it means that cells can have different heights, and it uses the correct height to display all the text. So that's one way to solve it. I think Stack Overflow is your best friend also for these kind of issues. There's a lot of answers on there. Also on our website, we have some answers. But yeah, sometimes it can be really difficult to find out why something is not scaling properly. I don't really have an answer for everything, but a lot of times on Stack Overflow, or maybe building your app in a different way, like building a new table view cell, or just maybe changing your interface design, it can be easier to support large font size. And then one of the biggest frustrations from people that are blind, because they use the screen reader, which we showed earlier in this webinar. You need to add labels to all images in your app. So for example, on the right side, you can see there's a button, which has like a cross. You can see that it's named small cross. But it should be named close, because the action is closing the pop-up. And it's the same for some other kind of bars. For example, you can see in the Mijn Overzicht on the left, you can see the hamburger menu, but the label is set to close, even though it's opening, it's not closing. So you need to make sure that labels are not only set to them, but they're also updated when the state changes. If your menu pops out, then the icon label should be close, and when you close it, then the label should be open menu. So how can you set a label to elements? On Android, you can use content description. It's basically like on HTML, like ARIA label or alt text, which is maybe more common on websites. So content description is the Android equivalent. And then hint, you can also use hint sometimes on some properties to set labels. So maybe on input fields, you can use a hint. Also on Android, you can use label for. So this means that if you have a form which has like a label, and below it you can have a input field, you can attach the label to the input field. So the input field, when you navigate on it with the screen reader, it will announce the label before you enter your text. So then when you go to like an email input field, it doesn't just say put in your email address, but it also announces the label which is above it. So this is also important for people that use screen readers, that they understand how what kind of information you require from them to enter. On iOS, it's called accessibility label, which is exactly the same as the content description. So same name, but they work exactly the same. And then you have accessibility hint, which works a little bit different than the hint on Android, because on iOS, the accessibility hint is only used for assistive technologies. But on Android, the hint can also be shown to people that are not using assistive technologies. So that's why it can sometimes be difficult to make something accessible on Android, because some of the properties are shared between non-assistive technology and assistive technology. So on iOS, it is usually a little bit easier to add extra information for people of assistive technology. So keep that into account. No questions, I see. So yeah, what's most important to check out is you can use voice control. And on voice control on iOS, you can turn on labels. So you can see all the labels for the elements on the screen. So this is how I made the screenshots on this slide. So if you enable voice control and enable labels on text, it's quite easy to spot mistakes on the screen. Another way to check labels is by using a screen reader. Then you can just go through each element on the screen, listen to what the screen reader is announcing, and you can check for yourself, is it clear? Small cross, is this clear or not? So in this case, small cross is not clear, but what is going to happen? So then you know that you need to change the label. One, which means that you have to put information and relationships, make them available also in a programmatic way. So a lot of times headings are bold. So people that are not blind, they can see that certain parts of the app are important, because a lot of times our brain works with scanning, like visually, the content on a screen. So usually your eyes, they go towards maybe the bold text, and then they understand, oh, this is easy to navigate. And for blind people or people that use screen readers, this is not the case, because they cannot see these kind of visual cues that headings give. So you have to mark them in the code as heading. And a lot of times it goes wrong in apps, because on websites, you have H1 tag, H2 tag, H3 tag. So it's already marked. Like the markup of HTML is already clear, because it's heading 1, heading 2, heading 3. But on Android and iOS, we don't have this element. So this is one of the issues with the web content accessibility guidelines. For websites, it's really easy or really clear that you should mark headings as headings. But on Android and iOS, the same guidelines apply, even though we don't have these kind of attributes. So we have to use it, make it possible in a different way. So the easiest way on Android, it's called viewCompat.setHeading. And then you can mark something as a heading. You can just pass a view and just say, okay, this is a heading. And then screen reader, when it goes to like the heading, it will announce app pauzeren, heading. So then someone that is visually impaired or blind that uses a screen reader, they know, oh, all right, this is a heading. And the second benefit of this is that if they, the screen reader can navigate by heading. So they can jump from heading 1, the first heading, to the second heading. So that way they can be just as quick as people that are not visually impaired to use an app. Otherwise, they need to listen to everything on the screen. But now they can just move from one heading to the second heading. Then they know, oh, I want to check my codes with Wi-Fi. And they can just easily skip to this part of the content. And on iOS, it works a little bit easier. It's called accessibility traits. It's a property you can set. If you set it to header, then it's marked as header. So that's quite straightforward on iOS. So it's really important, for screen reader users, that all the headings are marked as heading, because it can really make them a lot easier for them to understand how the app is built. So, or the screen, like what information on the screen, where can I find it, and how can I easily navigate through it. So make sure to mark your headings, not only visually as headings, but also in the code to add some properties. I don't see any questions about this. I'm moving on to the fifth issue. So this one is the same criterion, 1.3.1, so information and relationships. So this one is more about relationships. So a list, visually, if it's a list, it should also be a list for screen reader users. So one issue we had in the COVID Corona app, on the right side, you can see there's bullet points with the screen reader, which is marked with the green rectangle. it reads all of these issues as one block of content, even though visually it's a list. So if they want to maybe check, oh, symptom 1, do I have it? I don't know. Symptom 2, oh, but they can't navigate to symptom 2 or symptom 3 because all the symptoms are read aloud at the same time. So it can be really difficult for them to, check, do I have this symptom, yes or no, or not? Because they get just complete list of all symptoms in one go. And a second image, you can see where it's working correctly. You can see that it's showing the index, so 25 out of 28. So someone that's using a screen reader, they know that, okay, I am on item 25, a total of 28 items, so I'm almost at the bottom. Because if they don't know where they are in the list, visually you can see that you're at the bottom of the list, but with a screen reader you don't know this until you reach maybe the last item. But maybe you can imagine that the last is also this item. It's hard to know if it's the end of the list or it's the end of the screen or what is happening. So how can you do this? Well, good news, if you use Recycler View on Android, this is already default behavior. So the index and the end, like the index of elements is already implemented by default. So how does this work? Well, Recycler View uses accessibility node info compat, which is like it's a accessibility class which conveys information through the assistive technologies. So it uses the set collection info property and the set collection item info to say, hey, I have 28 items in total. I am element 1, I'm element 2, I'm element 3. So then the assistive technology, like a screen reader, they can announce, okay, I'm selected, I'm number 25 out of 28. So that's how that works. But the good news for us as developer is, just use Recycler View and it works. But the one problem is on the right. Doesn't always make sense to use Recycler View. So maybe if you show a list of bullet points, you maybe parse HTML, which is what we did, but then you lose the markup. So maybe just take into account if you use any kind of list or any kind of bullet points, try to use Recycler View and don't use your own kind of bullets. Make sure it's actually list items. I think my box there is in the way. So we have the UI table view on iOS, which is different than Recycler View on Android because it does not say the index and the total amount of items like Android does. So how do you make it accessible? Well, you can use accessibility hint on each item. You can set like you get the row number and also the section. So then you can make your own message and you can put it in accessibility hints. So people, if they are in the second list item, you can give them a little bit of a hint where they are. One thing that I made is like an extension of UI table view, which does this automatically. Because then all the UI table views you use are accessible by default. It's open source somewhere in the Corona check GitHub, but later I'm planning to make like a library for Android and iOS with some useful methods. So maybe if you're interested in this, you can email me. My contact details will be at the last slide. So I'm trying to see some comments. Jeroen saying users can turn hints off. Is it not better to put the selectievakje 25 of 28 as part of the label announcement instead of using a hint for it? This is a good point. On iOS, users have the possibility to turn off hints. But I also had a discussion with this with another accessibility expert, which also happens to be blind himself. And he told me that, yes, you can put it also in the label, because then it's always announced. But it can be a downside for people that use Braille, so like Braille in Dutch, because then with Braille, they cannot easily skip through this, because they also get all the hints that are, maybe they don't even need it. they always get this on their Braille device. So that's why he suggested to use accessibility hint. But it's a good point that people can turn off the hint. So if the information is really important, do not put in the hint. But if it's like secondary, so maybe it can be useful or maybe not, then I think it's a good spot to use the hint. Then number 6, it's called mark buttons. So this one is another criterion. It's 4.1.2. It's called name role value. It means that all elements of your interface, they should have a name, they should have a role, and they should have a value. So one thing that goes wrong a lot of times is that people actually, developers, they make their own custom buttons, which are not marked up as a button. So maybe you use a text view, you give it like a blue background, and it's not actually a button. But for people that are using screen readers, they do not know if it's a button or not, because they cannot see the visual background, for example. So that's why it's important for them to make sure that you mark buttons as button. So on Android, how you can do this is using the accessibility node info compat again. So it's a really long name, but it's important to remember this one. I suggest you to use the set class name method, and then you can pass the button class, because then Android automatically translates it for you in all the languages that are supported. Because you can also use the set role description, and you can maybe use a string like button. But then if someone is using their phone in Dutch, it also says button, but it should say knop. And maybe someone is using his phone in Arabic language or Turkish language or any other language. It's not translated. So that's why I suggest you to use the class name. So basically you can make any custom component behave like a button if you pass the class name. So that's the easiest way, in my opinion, to mark it as a button. On iOS, it's a little bit easier. You can use accessibility traits, just like the heading. There's a trait for button. So if you use the trait button, it will just say button in whatever language the user has set their device to. Take into account, whenever you're making your own custom components, make sure to put the name, role, and value correctly. So even if people cannot see the visual cues, like it's circular corners, or it's a dark background, or it looks like a button, it also needs to be set to a button programmatically, because otherwise screen reader users will not know if they can press a button or if it's just a piece of text. Because if they know it's a button, then they know they can activate the button. And if it just says I have a code, they don't know if it's text is a button. So yeah, that's why it's important to mark as a button. No questions about this one. Number 7, it's marking and activating links. So it's a combination of multiple success criteria. 1.3.1, which was about information and relationships. 2.4.4, which is about clear links, and also 4.1.2, which is about the name, role, and value. So what happens a lot of times on Android, but also on iOS, is that a link is embedded in a piece of text. So you can click on it using touch, but a lot of times with a screen reader, or for example voice control or any other assistive technology, you're not able to touch this item because you do not use touch, you use a different kind of interaction. So you need to make sure that users can navigate to the links and activate them. So it's quite difficult on Android how to do this. They introduced a new method, really long one. It's called viewcompat.enable accessible clickable span support. So in my opinion, this method name is not really accessible, not really easy to remember, but it does work. So if you're using spans to put links in pieces of text, so you use URL span, I suggest you to add or call this view compat method because it does some magic things to make sure that it works on assistive technology. You can also use Linkify or link movement method, which is probably familiar to people that develop Android apps. By using those methods, sometimes it also works to activate them, but it really depends. It also depends on Android versions. Some Android versions it does work, some Android versions it does not. So that's why they introduced this view compat method, which does some magic things for each Android version to make sure it's accessible. And with accessible, I mean it's marked as a button, so it says link, and also that you can actually activate it without using touch. On iOS, it's a little bit easier again. You can use accessibility traits and set it to a link. So then a piece of text is marked as a link. And you can also use NS mutable attributed string. You can add an attribute of link to a part of the mutable or part of the attributed string, because then this part is link and activate it. So basically, that's an overview of how to mark and activate your link. So it's not as straightforward as you might expect. If you just use HTML or something and put a tag in it, for link, and parse it on Android and iOS, usually this does not work. So you need to have some extra code in there to make it work for assistive technologies. Otherwise, they cannot access the links, and they can, for example, not read your privacy policy or not click on any other kind of link. So this one is quite important to try out in your app. I see a question from Jeroen again. Also buttons that navigate outside the app. We add a link trait instead of a button trait on iOS to indicate the user is leaving app. What do you think about that? There's a good point. It's also a little bit difficult maybe on the difference between web again and apps. The problem is that it's not really clear in the guidelines if you should set a link as a link or as a button or whatever. So what I do personally, I think it's personal preference. I don't think we really can get, you do not pass success criteria, but I personally mark all UI elements like list items and those kind of items as buttons, even if they go to external content. And I mark links, like links in text, I mark them only those I mark as links. But again, imagine if you have like a link that goes to an outside web browser or something, it can make sense to also mark those as a link. But I think it's personal preference. There's not really guidelines right now for apps. So I think it's personal preference. I think it's most important that you are consistent. So if all external buttons or all buttons that go to external components or interfaces or browsers, if they're all marked as link, then it's fine. So I think consistency is most important in this case. Then almost at the end of the presentation, it's number 8, grouping elements. Why would you do this? To make it easier for people that use assistive technologies, like a screen reader, to go through your app. So imagine if you did not group elements, it would first read, usually even would read the image, which is just, it's just visually for people that are not blind. So it doesn't really make sense to navigate to them in this case. Then you have the title, and then you have the description. But what you can do, as shown in the picture with a rectangle, you can group everything together as one element. So then it is a lot easier for blind users or people of assistive technology that it behaves as one list item or one button. So how can you achieve this? On Android, you can use the focusable attribute. So you should set focusable to false for the title, image, and the description. And then you should set focusable to the root layout. So the linear layout or whatever kind of layout you're using, the layout should be focusable. You set a content description, which describes everything that's inside of the layout. To group everything together as one group. In newer versions of Android, you can also use screen reader focusable. It's just like I mentioned before on iOS and Android. On Android, a lot of traits are shared. So focusable, it also means that people that use touch, if you put it to false, they also cannot use it anymore. So that's why they introduced screen reader focusable. This one just affects screen reader users. They also have a property it's called important for accessibility. It's something you can use to mark something as important for accessibility. Usually you don't really need this as far as I know, but sometimes, maybe you can look at the documentation to see if you can use it. On iOS, I think personally it's a little bit easier again. On the root element, you set the should group accessibility children to true. Then it means that all children are grouped together to the parent. And then also make sure, of course, that the parent element is actually marked as accessibility element. Otherwise, you can still not navigate to that item. And also make sure to set accessibility label to the root element, because also and everything to users. Moving on to the last one of the webinar, it's called focus order. This one is part of success criteria 1.3.2 and 2.4.3. So those are more about how users navigate in your app or how the focus moves into an app. What I have noticed is that there are some issues on Android if you use like the navigation component. So personally, if accessibility is really important to you, I suggest you to use activity where possible instead of using fragments, because whenever you push a new activity, the focus management just goes a lot better than fragments. I think Android or Google themselves, they suggest to use fragments for everything, but for accessibility, my personal opinion is that activity usually works better. So I really hope that they fix these issues in new releases, because I would really like to use fragments and also use the navigation component to navigate between fragments and everything. But for now, there are some bugs which may or may not happen with your app. It depends on how you use it, but at least with the Corona apps, we noticed some issues with accessibility. Then we have the same accessibility properties as I just described. And one thing you can do to move focus order manually, it's called send accessibility event. And you can send a type view focused. So then you can force a screen reader or the keyboard to move to a certain element on the screen. And on iOS, you can also do this with, it's called a screen change notification. You can move or force move the focus to certain elements. I suggest you to not use these properties, but sometimes it can improve the user experience. But it really make sure to not use them if it's not needed, because usually, the OS, the operating system, should take care of the focus order for you if your app is programmed correctly. So that's it for this webinar. My goal is that you try out one of those assistive technology features on your own apps and make your apps more accessible. Maybe you can download our own app. It's also open source. It's accessible. So you can look into our own source code and see, maybe you can learn something from it. And we also have our knowledge base in it. It's available for free for everyone. Maybe if you are a professional and need some services, what I do is like, accessibility audit, also user testing, development, consultancy, training. So if you have any questions or any need for any kind of accessibility audit, you can reach me by email. Also feel free if you have any questions after this presentation to email me. I will gladly try to answer them for you. So,
well, thank you, Jan-Jaap. I think there are still some questions in the chat. I don't know if you answered them already. Paulo, how do you test all of this?
Yes, so how do you test all this? Testing. It's kind of a specific job, right? It's basically you can become like an accessibility expert or do some, education in this. But the easiest way to get started, in my opinion, is to use the screen reader, which you can learn with our app, which is free. You can learn the gestures of VoiceOver and also learn the gestures of TalkBack. And then once you know those gestures, you can try them out in your own app. You can see if you can use your app by using the screen reader. Because if the screen reader works, then usually the other assistive technologies also work. So if you want to get started with accessibility testing, I suggest you to get started with learning how to use a screen reader. Because that's, for my opinion, the easiest way to get started. Then, Alan, how about pop-ups? They mostly use fragments in Android. Yeah, that's true, but if you use like pop-ups on Android and also pop-ups on iOS, usually the operating system automatically moves focus. So if you use, for example, on iOS, it automatically moves the focus to the dialogue. So basically, that's also to summarize some issues. The more native components you use and not components of third parties, the more likely your app is accessible. So make sure if you use any kind of fancy third-party pop-up libraries or whatever, a lot of times they're not accessible. So choose wisely when to use third-party libraries and when not to use them. I see another one. It's automated unit / instrumented tests. There are some, Jeroen also answered this already. There are some automation possible, and like contrast of colors, you can calculate this, which I've not mentioned in this presentation, but it's also one of the guidelines that you need to have enough contrast in your app. Touch target size also one, like buttons need to be large enough and those kind of things. But a lot of times, especially on apps, there's not really any freely available automation tools. So on websites, you maybe can use X. It's like AXE. It's also available for Android, but not really the same features. You can use a free version. But for actual accessibility testing, like automation, there's not really any free tools. There are some paid tools available, but they are really expensive. So maybe only the big corporates can afford them. It's really a shame, in my opinion, because I think all apps should be accessible, not just expensive and big apps. But for now, that's there's no really good tools available to automatically test your app, except for the ones built into Android Studio and the ones built into Xcode. But those are not automated. Those are like manual testing, but they do work very well. So I think that's all for the questions.
Yeah, I think that there were all the questions, Jan-Jaap. Well, thank you very much for giving this presentation and guiding us through the world of accessibility. As you mentioned, they can contact you if they have any further questions afterwards regarding accessibility. I think I just want to thank you for your time and good luck, everybody.
Yes, thanks everyone for joining, and let me know if you have any questions or if you make any improvements on your app. I will gladly. I'm trying to make a list of accessible apps on our website. So if you make an app which is accessible, please let me know, and I can put it on our website and give it a little bit of a showcase, because really like to see more accessible apps. All right, enjoy your evening, and maybe we will be in touch.
Have a good evening, everybody.